Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sleeping Night, where darkness hides incredible stories. Today, we'll dive into a world of mysteries, adventures, and unexpected twists. Get ready for a story that will keep you on edge from beginning to end. If you enjoy the story, make sure to subscribe and give a like. The boy called Arthur lived on the outskirts of the world, or so it seemed to him. Huddled in a thatch-roofed hut that the wind battered and the moss threatened to claim as its own. He was a tall lad of 17, though his thinness had always made him seem taller, a narrowness emphasized by the way his shoulders arched forward under the weight of every day. His black hair grew wild, stubbornly resisting the comb, and his eyes, gray as a frozen puddle, looked out at the world with a wary, sidelong glance. It had been 5 years since Arthur's parents died. The village would whisper that his mother was taken by the fever that swept through the valley one spring, while his father simply withered away thereafter, as if his lungs had forgotten how to draw breath without her. Arthur remembered the sickness, the endless cough, the smell of boiled cloves and vinegar that failed to mask the stench of slow rot. More vividly, he remembered the silence that followed, the silence of being left behind in a cottage choked with their absence. The other villagers did not trouble themselves with him. They paid him the passing respect owed to the dead's kin, a nod or a muttered word. But Arthur had learned early not to expect kindness from anyone but the goats and the wind. The priest sometimes sent a pot of stew or a heel of bread, but the priest was old and half-blind, and mostly pitied Arthur for never receiving a proper burial for his parents. The graveyard had been full, the earth too hard to turn that bitter winter, so Arthur had buried them himself, out beyond the last stone wall, where roots tangled around bones and the snow melted slower. In the years since, Arthur had grown into a kind of feral independence. Each morning, he woke before the sun, hands stiff in the cold, and set out to gather firewood or trap rabbits in the frost-bitten underbrush. If the trap came up empty, he would boil nettles or chew on bark, and at night, he would stare up through the smoke hole in his roof and wonder if anyone anywhere remembered that he existed at all. Loneliness, once a wound, had become the skin he lived in. Sometimes, in the soft hour before dusk, Arthur would walk the edge of the woods and sense that something watched him from the blackness between the trees. The villagers claimed the forest was haunted, wolves that walked as men, shadows that spoke with the voices of lost children, a darkness older than the stones themselves. Arthur had never seen these things, but he believed the forest's danger more readily than the promises of any living soul. His hands grew calloused, his feet tough as boiled leather, and he learned to listen for the smallest changes in the wind or the hush of wings overhead. Yet for all his caution, Arthur nursed a secret hope that one day, someone, would call him out from his hut and speak his name, as if it mattered. Until then, Arthur survived. Each day a repetition of the last, each night a slow retreat from the cold. And so it was on the morning of the 7th day of the gray month, when Arthur woke to an unnatural quiet, a quiet so dense it seemed to press against his skull, that the story of his life began to shift, if only by a breath. Each dawn, Arthur awoke in the same shuddering chill, the furs he slept beneath laced with the damp breath of autumn. His bed, little more than a pile of rags and stitched hides, rested on the earthen floor, which he swept each morning with a makeshift broom of bound reeds. The ritual was a kind of prayer, an insistence that order held sway even in a world that had forgotten him. He would light the fire with the dry moss and twigs he stored beside the hearth, coaxing the first reluctant flames until a glow crept up the blackened stones where once
Long ago, his mother's soups had simmered and her bread had risen, making the whole hut smell briefly of comfort. The hut, if it could bear the dignity of a name, was a squat, moss-clad dome, lashed together from centuries-old timbers and the sodden thatch his father and he had repaired each year until the fever took his mother. And then neither of them cared much for maintenance. Its single window was a rectangle of horn, yellowed and brittle, and through it Arthur could see the indifferent gray of the meadow, sometimes glazed with hoarfrost, sometimes heavy with the fog that drifted up from the river at the valley's edge. His mother had once told him that the fog was the breath of sleeping giants, a story he had not thought about in years, but that returned now, unbidden, whenever the mist pressed against the window and billowed through the cracks in the stone. Arthur's days rarely deviated from the pattern necessity had set for him. He would rise, tend the goats if the wolves had left them, fetch water from the well, and then make the long walk to the village proper, where he traded milk or cheese for whatever he could not forage or snare himself. He had never liked the village, its neat rows of timber houses, the sullen faces of men who measured everything by the weight of a coin or a grudge. But it was the only world that existed beyond his own. On market days, he kept to the edges, wary of the children who sometimes followed him, singing nonsense rhymes about orphans and ghosts, and of the matrons who hissed and crossed themselves when he passed. Even here he felt the exile of his blood, as if the death of his parents had marked him with contagion. He could not remember a time when words had not been his only friends. He spoke to himself in the mornings, to the fire as he stoked it, to the rain as it battered the roof, to the goats who listened with more patience than any human. Sometimes, when the loneliness pressed too hard and the silence echoed, he would recall his mother's voice reading verses from the old book, or his father's heavy tread across the yard at dusk. He had little left of them. Her shawl, his knife, and a single silver coin hidden in the thatch for an emergency that had never yet materialized. But their shadows lingered in the cottage, in the way he swept, in the careful knots he tied when mending the fence, in the cadence of grief that underlay each day like a low and constant drum. On this particular morning, Arthur felt the day twisting against itself from the start. The goats bleated in a frenzy when he entered the lean-to, their eyes rolling white in a panic he could not decipher. The well's bucket came up with a muddy slush instead of clean water, and the sky, though clear, seemed to press down with a weight that made his temples throb. When he tried to mend the outer wall, the stones bit at his knuckles, drawing thin lines of blood that would not clot. It was as if the world wanted him awake and alert, though for what, he could not say. He decided to go into the forest. The decision was both automatic and momentous, a thing he did most days, yet a thing that always carried the thrill of risk. The woods were a tangled mass, dark even at noon, a place of legends and warnings. His father had taught him the safe paths, but even so, Arthur's heart beat faster as he crossed the threshold of shadow, where the brambles snagged his trousers and the moss muffled his steps. He had told himself it was just for firewood or late berries, but he carried his father's knife and the empty sack with a nervous, ritual care. The further he walked, the quieter it became. Silence in the woods was never absolute. There was always the scrape of branch, the drip of water, the distant cough of a crow. But today, there was nothing, not even the wind. Arthur stopped, listening. The air had grown thick, and every sound he made seemed to vanish into it, swallowed up by a hush that was heavier than any blanket of snow. He could hear his own breathing, harsh and uneven, and the distant thud of his heart. It was a different kind of silence than he had known, the silence after his parents died. That had been hollow. A void. This was dense. A presence. He felt it settle over his bones as he stepped deeper into the trees. Felt the cold climb up his arms and nestle at the base of his skull. The woods themselves seemed changed. The light filtered through the canopy as if through leaded glass. The tree trunks elongated, their shadows impossibly long and sharp. He walked on, feet dragging, every sense straining for the familiar. A squirrel, a bird call, the trickle of water. Nothing. He began to wonder if he had passed through some unseen door, if this was a different wood or a different world entirely. He told himself to turn back, but the path behind him looked unfamiliar. The undergrowth rearranged into strange, threatening patterns. He pressed on, more out of stubbornness than bravery, refusing to let the silence conquer him as it had after the fever. His mind raced with half-memories. His mother's stories of the witchwood. His father's warnings about never eating the berries that grew under certain trees. The old priest's muttered prayers for lost children and wandering souls. It was only when he reached the ancient yew near the dry creek, a landmark he had used 1,000 times, that he realized he was not alone. The silence had shifted, as if making way for something that entered the woods behind him, and the hairs on his arms stood up as if charged by lightning. He turned, expecting perhaps a wolf or a poacher, or even one of the boys from the village come to throw stones or taunts. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. Just the endless silence and the trees pressing in, waiting. That was when he heard his name spoken, quiet as a breath, but clear as water, from somewhere just beyond the boundary of sight. He wandered, dazed beneath the twisting branches, as if spellbound, following some indistinct urge. The forest's silence was as complete as the hush in a church at midnight. His feet, without his conscious command, carried him toward the oldest part of the wood, where the standing stones hunched like ancient sentinels, and the moss was so thick it smothered even the memory of footsteps. It was there, in a hollow he would have sworn had not existed yesterday or the day before, that Arthur found the well. It crouched at the forest's heart, a crude ring of stones mortared with black earth and rimmed by whiskers of lichen and moss. No path led to it, and no grass grew nearby. The trees arched overhead, their roots knuckling upward, as if trying to deny this thing a place among them. The well's mouth was wide, the stones wet and slick, and the darkness within seemed to absorb every trace of light. The very air around it was colder, the silence deeper, and the hairs on Arthur's arms rose of their own accord. He stepped closer, unable to help himself, and peered over the edge. The well was impossibly deep. Its throat yawned so far that the bottom disintegrated into shadow. Yet from far below, he heard the echo of water, a faint, deliberate plink, as if a single droplet fell into an infinite pool. The sound was so regular, so patient, that it felt less like nature and more like the ticking of a monstrous clock. Arthur's breathing grew shallow. His father had told stories of such places, old wells sealed for a reason, places where the world was thin and other things came through. He remembered being small, forbidden to play near the ruins of the abandoned abbey, warned against the old Roman cisterns that dotted the moors. Wells were thresholds, his father had said, and what waited beneath them was meant to stay there. He should have turned back. He knew this, in the deep reptile part of his brain. But he did not. Instead, he reached out a hand and touched the rim. It was slick and freezing, and when he drew his hand back, his fingers were stippled with green lichen, as if the well had tried to mark him. Something moved behind him. a gust of wind, a shifting of shadows, and Arthur's heart lurched. His nerves sang with the certainty that he was being watched, not by animal eyes, but by something older, colder, and far more patient. Still he lingered, peering into the void, hypnotized by the rhythm of the falling water. He was uncertain, later, whether he slipped of his own clumsiness, or whether something unseen had given him the barest push. 1 second, his boot was on slick moss. The next, he was plunging downward, his arms windmilling for purchase on the cold, greasy stones. The world telescoped. Every surface was a blur. The well's mouth shrank to a coin of light and then vanished. He dropped, struck something, a ledge, a root, a sudden outthrust of gritty stone, then tumbled again, the blows sending sparks behind his eyelids. Once he thought he heard a voice, a single word in a language he'd never known, but it was swallowed by the rush of air and the roar of blood in his skull. He landed hard in water, but the impact stunned him and drove the breath from his lungs. For a moment he thrashed, certain he would drown, but the water was shallow, ice cold, foul, and thick with silt. He crawled, gasping, to a kind of shelf at the base of the shaft. There was no light, no sound but the echoing drip, and the only smell was rot and damp earth. He landed with such force that his vision burst into white stars. The last thing Arthur registered was the cold shock of water before darkness claimed him completely. When consciousness returned, he was lying face down in frigid muck. Each breath drew in the stench of decay and ancient soil. His clothes clung to him, sodden and heavy. He blinked rapidly, but the darkness remained absolute. Not the darkness of night, but of burial. "Hello?" he called, voice cracking. The word bounced back at him, mocking. Pain lanced through his ribs with each breath. Arthur's trembling fingers explored outward, finding rough stone. As he pulled himself upright, his head nearly brushed against something. Confused, he reached up and touched the ceiling of the shaft. A surge of hope cut through his terror. The well wasn't deep anymore. Standing carefully on tiptoes, his outstretched hands found handholds in the stone. He tested one, wincing as his bruised body protested, then began the slow, agonizing climb toward a circle of gray that had appeared above. It took more than an hour, or perhaps only a minute. Time had become a fibrous, tangled thing, impossible to unravel, before Arthur finally heaved himself over the edge of the well and sprawled, shuddering, onto the cold forest floor. He lay there for a long moment, clutching the moss, chest heaving, half expecting the stones to give way and drag him back down. But the world around him was utterly still, and when he finally rolled to his back, he found himself staring up at a sky that was neither day nor night, but a sickly luminous between. The trees overhead were the same species as before. Oak, beech, yew, all knotted and ancient. But their leaves were impossibly green, glowing as if with their own inner fire. The air was heavier here, wet and syrupy, and every breath sent a sweet metallic tang to the back of his tongue. Arthur staggered to his feet and nearly collapsed again as pain lanced through his left ankle. He hissed, bracing himself against the well, and looked around. The hollow was the same, but not. The stones of the well were black with a sheen like oil, and the ground was littered with white, papery things that might have been petals or bones. He reached down and picked one up. It dissolved at his touch, leaving only a faint trace of cold. There was no wind, but the branches above rustled in a constant conspiratorial susurrus, like an audience muttering just out of earshot. He forced himself to move, scared of staying still, more scared of what might happen if he waited for darkness to return. He limped away from the well, keeping it at his back, and plunged into the woods. But the woods had changed. Paths that should have led home now doubled back on themselves, or ended abruptly in groves of trees that seemed to have grown overnight. The undergrowth was too lush, too alive, sprouting strange ferns that curled in on themselves like sleeping hands and flowers that pulsed with a cold blue light. Even the bird song was absent, replaced by a faint, syncopated tapping that he could not locate. He tried to retrace his steps, to remember the way home, but every landmark twisted at the edge of memory. The ancient yew by the dry creek was a coppice now, the dry creek a churning, sluggish vein of black water. The ground sloped in unfamiliar directions. When he tried to orient himself by the sun, he found it obscured behind a thick, motionless membrane of cloud. Once, thinking he saw the outline of the village's church tower above the trees, he ran toward it, only to find himself standing before the well again, the oily black stones gleaming with an unpleasant familiarity. It went on like this for hours, or was it days? His hunger dulled to a distant ache. Thirst became the more urgent torment, and eventually he gave in and cupped water from a trickling spring. It tasted like iron and thyme and something else, something that stung his tongue and made his teeth ache. He spat it out, only to discover the moss beneath his feet pulsed in synchrony with his own racing heart. Through it all, the thought of home pressed against the inside of his skull. He imagined the candle burning low on his father's old table, the goats bleating with hunger, the empty sack waiting for sundown. The cottage was out there, must be, but in this place, even the certainty of his own memories was beginning to thin, to unravel, to slip away like smoke through the fingers. He tried again and again to find the path that would take him home, but the more he walked, the more the world rebelled against him. The trees leaned closer, their branches forming archways that led only to more confusion. The air grew thick with the scent of rotting fruit and bruised flowers, and the ground, too, became untrustworthy. He would step onto what looked like solid earth only to find it sopping and treacherous, or stumble into gullies that had not existed a moment before. Arthur began to dread the prospect of ever escaping this place. He feared that he was being tested or punished, or that he had died in the fall and this was the afterlife, strange, lonely, mutable. At times he wondered if he was even himself anymore, or if he had left something essential behind, shed like a skin in the darkness at the bottom of the well. He pressed on, more stubbornly than ever, refusing to let the uncertainty conquer him as it had after his parents' deaths. The air grew denser with each step, the colors more lurid, the silences more absolute, until it seemed he was walking through a fever dream of the world he had known. He tried every so often to call out for help. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But the sound of his own voice was swallowed instantly, as if the trees themselves were drinking his words. Occasionally, he glimpsed movement at the edge of vision, a flash of white, a ripple in the moss, a shadow darting between trunks. Each time he rushed toward it, desperate for connection, but each time he found only the empty forest, the well gnawing at his thoughts, waiting for him to return. He began to lose track of himself, of time, of purpose. He moved because stopping meant death, or worse, he walked because he did not know what else to do. His only anchor was the memory of his father's voice, repeating warnings and stories and prayers that, here, sounded less like wisdom and more like the babble of the lost. Still, he pressed on, step by stubborn step, until everything around him blurred into a single, unbroken strangeness. He walked until his legs gave out, and he collapsed beneath a twisted hawthorn, the branches above clawing at a sky the color of bruised fruit. As dusk falls, Arthur's fear deepens. When exhaustion finally drove him to collapse, he did not so much fall asleep as surrender, curling beside a root that bulged from the earth like a knuckle. He woke much later, unsure if minutes or hours had passed, and found the forest drowned in a darkness so deep it felt physical, pressing against his skin. Slowly, with stiff fingers, he turned onto his back and stared upward through the branches. And then he saw it. The moon, if it was the moon, loomed monstrously large, a silver coin pressed almost close enough to touch. Its craters were visible even to the naked eye, sharp as wounds. Around it, two other celestial bodies hung like companions, glowing with a cold, steady light. One copper red, the other a pale, eerie green. Arthur's breath caught. His whole body went cold despite the clammy heat that still clung to his skin. He had heard old stories about travelers wandering into fairy rings, about waking in the wrong season or the wrong century. But this was worse. This was not his sky. He whispered a single word. No. But it came out hoarse, almost a croak. He could not look away. The stars seemed arranged in strange patterns, constellations he did not know, and as he watched, he thought he saw one of the planets move slightly, as though turning to watch him back. Arthur curled in on himself, clutching his head, trying to remember the old prayers his father taught him. But the words felt hollow and strange. He felt as though something had closed around him. Not just the forest, but the world itself. And he had been locked inside. For a long, stunned interval, Arthur could only stare upward, his breath coming in shallow gulps, as if the air itself had thickened around him. The sight of those foreign moons and alien stars hammered at his senses until his knees buckled, sending him down into the loamy black earth. He pressed his hands hard into the moss, feeling it pulse faintly, as if the ground itself was monitoring the rhythm of his heart. It was impossible. It was madness. But it was happening, and the shock of that certainty struck him harder than the fall down the well. He knelt there, trembling, the odd tang of the air burning his throat, and whispered, "No, no, no," until the words lost all meaning. Yet the sky above did not waver or dissolve into some more plausible nightmare. Instead, the three moons watched in perfect silence, and if anything, the constellations seemed to blink and reform whenever he looked away, as if responding to his refusal. A memory pricked him, sharp as a nettle. The old women in the village square, whom he had once dismissed as half-mad, gossiping about travelers who vanished at the edge of the woods. They spoke of paths that led nowhere, of children lost for a day and returning with their hair turned white, of whole families who sat down to supper and were never seen again. He remembered the whispered word, elf-shot, the way grown men spat over their shoulders when the subject came up, and the stories of people who returned, changed, hollowed out, unable to speak of what they'd seen. Even his own father, who scoffed at such tales, had warned him never to linger near the old barrows at dusk, because sometimes the doors open and you don't want to see what's on the other side. Now Arthur understood. He'd crossed a door, tripped some invisible threshold, and the price was exile to a world that was almost but not quite his own. He was not merely lost in the woods. He was lost in the very idea of woods. Here, the rules were different. The map had no key, and the sky itself was a rebuke to everything he thought he understood. He clung to the dirt, as if it could anchor him, but the forest's silence closed in, so complete it seemed the trees were waiting for him to break, to weep, to beg for release. He felt extraordinarily small, less than an insect on the bark, a trespasser among beings that regarded him as little more than a curiosity or a pest. He tried to summon anger, tried to assert his right to exist, but the vast indifference of the world around him crushed such thoughts before they could take root. In this realm, his name, his memories, the entire brittle history of his life meant nothing. He was alone. He felt, acutely and with a terror beyond words, that he had been locked inside something, some organism, some puzzle, some mind, and that it would never, ever let him go. Arthur could not tell whether his body had seized with cold or terror, only that his limbs refused all instruction save for the pitiful act of shivering. He drew his knees close, arms locked around them, and pressed his brow into the damp, root-knuckled earth. Above him, the moon's light was insistent, unblinking, as though it sought to pin him to the ground and catalog his every failing. He did not want to be seen, not by the monstrous sky or the sentient hush of the forest or the pulsing moss that seemed to shift beneath his cheek. He wanted only to be small, to vanish, to become nothing at all. He let the night press in, let the unfamiliar stars stare through him, and waited for some cave in his heart to swallow him up. He remembered stories his mother told in the hush of winter evenings. Fairy tales, she'd called them, but always with a warning stitched into the hem. "Don't linger in the woods after dark," she'd said, "or you'll find yourself in a place you don't belong, and you'll never quite fit back into the world you left behind." At the time, Arthur had laughed, too old for bedtime fears, but now it was all he could do to keep from sobbing like a child. He did not sleep, not really. His mind circled itself, replaying the fall down the well, the bruising cold of the water, and the strange, consuming hush that had greeted him here. When he finally lifted his head and blinked into the silver-sharp air, his whole body ached, and he could not say if dawn were near or if the moon simply waxed and waned as they pleased in this place. The darkness, at least, had softened a degree. The forest transformed from black void to a world rendered in charcoal and whitewash. He remembered, with a sudden savage clarity, the moment he'd realized no one would come looking for him. It had been years ago, after his mother died, and his father took to wandering the fens in search of peace or oblivion. Arthur never knew which. That first winter alone, he'd waited for days, lighting the single lamp in the window, eyes stinging with the effort of hope. When hope finally guttered out, it had left behind a hollow place where something hard and sharp began to grow. That same feeling flowered in him now, thorns threading through bone. No one was coming. Not from the village, not from anywhere. He was as abandoned as the moon itself. He rocked slightly, clutching his knees, and wondered what would become of him. Would he wander forever, hunger gnawing until he became part of the moss or the mud? Would he lose himself entirely, like the children from the stories, and forget even his own name? The notion chilled him more than the night. He was Arthur, son of Morwen and Edric. He had built the goat pen with his own hands. He had buried his mother beside the wild roses. He had once been a person who belonged to a world. He would not let that be unmade by the whim of a sky he did not recognize. He forced himself upright, each movement a negotiation with pain. His hands and face were smeared with dirt, and something greenish that smelled medicinal, but he ignored this, reaching instead for the comfort of motion. He scraped moss from his arms and stood, wavering, until the world stopped tilting beneath his feet. The forest did not greet him. It merely regarded him, patient as the grave. He picked a direction, any direction, and began to walk. The trees had a logic of their own, their trunks spiraling and bifurcating with no pattern he could decode. But eventually, he found a stand of hollies, their leaves glossy and familiar. The comfort was fleeting, but he clung to it. He scavenged for water, found a trickle in the hollow of a stone, and drank deeply despite the aftertaste of rust. Hunger was a dull echo in his belly, but thirst had sharpened to a blade. He drank until the stone was dry, then continued, pausing only to tear a strip of bark for chewing. It was bitter, but it kept his mouth from cracking with dryness. He walked until the light changed, though whether it was morning or some trick of the moon's he could not tell. His arms and legs prickled with fatigue, but he forced himself to keep moving, convinced that idleness would be fatal. At length he came to a clearing where the ground rose in a gentle knoll. Here the grass was short and silvery, and the air tasted faintly of salt. He scanned the horizon, searching for anything that might resemble shelter or civilization, but saw only the endless, undulating canopy. He sat on the knoll and tried to make sense of his situation. Despair threatened, rising like floodwater, but he would not let himself drown in it. He remembered his father's words, spoken not as comfort, but as a kind of challenge. The world takes what it wants, Arthur, and it never gives it back. The only thing you have is what you do while you're here. He had not understood it then, but now the meaning was plain as a fist. He said it aloud, to the strange sky. The only thing I have is what I do. His voice trembled, but he did not care. If this was to be his world, then he would claim it, even if it killed him. He surveyed the clearing and began making plans. He stripped long grasses and twisted them into cord, remembering how his mother taught him to weave rope for the fishing net. He gathered stones and stacked them in a loose ring, hoping to trap warmth if he could ever manage to make a fire. He searched the perimeter for anything edible, and when he found a cluster of mushrooms beneath a rotted log, he tested them on the tip of his tongue and waited, watching his body for signs of revolt. There were none, and so he ate, careful and slow. Night returned, or perhaps it had never left, only circled above him in shifting phases. Arthur sat by his makeshift camp, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the moons. He would not sleep yet, not until he had mapped the shapes of every star and learned the cadence of every sound in the forest. He had no faith in rescue, no hope that this ordeal was a dream waiting to be shaken off. There was only the world, and his stubborn refusal to be unmade by it. He spoke softly, not to the moons, but to himself, repeating the old prayers and maxims his parents left him. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his fear, a scaffolding for whatever would come next. It was not courage, not really, that kept him moving, kept him alive. It was something older and meaner, a refusal to let the world swallow him whole. That, he decided, would be enough. He would live, or at least die trying. He clenched his jaw, the first spark of determination breaking through the fog of terror. His father's words came back to him. A man's worth is in what he does, not what he fears. And Arthur let them fill the hollow space inside him. He would find water, find food, and keep walking until he understood this place. For the first time since the fall, he no longer felt like prey. Arthur sat long on the knoll, turning over stones and stray twigs, counting out the hours and knots of his own solitude. He tried to catalog the forest, to impose a logic on the tangle of branches and the ceaseless arc of the moons, but the world resisted every attempt to be measured or mapped. Even the passage of time seemed arbitrary. The sky would not commit to day or night, and the shifting shadows on the ground only mocked his efforts at orientation. Still, he persisted, because he knew that stopping would mean surrendering to whatever hollow thing waited at the center of this place. When his legs refused to hold him any longer, he made a seat of the root and hunched there, elbows on knees, the tattered hem of his cloak gathered close about his neck. As he shivered, he became acutely aware of how much of his old life was missing. The rough wool of his bedding, the sweet rot of the cottage hearth, the distant bleats and huffs that signaled other living things shared the world with him. Here, there was only the push and pull of his own breath, the relentless scrutiny of the moons overhead, and the faint, medicinal tang of the moss that clung to his fingers. Arthur had never wanted to believe in curses or spells, but now he wondered if he himself was the locus of some old, unlooked-for magic, and if so, whether it could ever be undone. He tried to keep his eyes open, to listen for the crunch of leaves or the snap of a twig that would mean rescue, or at least the presence of another. He was alert, feverishly so, his mind more awake than his body had ever been. He catalogued every sound: the sighing wind through dry grass, the distant trickle of water, the occasional rustle that could be nothing or everything. He replayed the warnings his mother used to murmur about fey places and the hazards of wandering off the path, wondering if it was possible for a world to be built entirely out of such warnings, as if the stories she'd spun at his bedside had sprouted roots and become real the moment he stopped believing in them. But vigilance was a thin and temporary armor, and his exhaustion was bottomless and cunning. It circled him, patient and wolf-like, waiting for the precise moment when his guard would falter. He fought it at first by reciting the names of all the things he once loved: the taste of river trout, the press of sun-warmed stones against bare feet, his mother's voice on the day she taught him to swim. But after a while, even these memories thinned and blurred, and he found himself drifting in and out of a waking stupor, half dreaming, half listening, unable to distinguish between the two. He tried to will himself upright, but his limbs had grown heavy and insubordinate. His arms and legs tingled as if they belonged to someone else, and his head lolled forward, barely kept aloft by the stubborn hinge of his neck. He told himself he would not sleep, not here, not now, but the thought had already begun to dissolve even as he formed it. He clung to the roughness of the root, digging his fingers in until they hurt, but the pain was distant, like pressure under water. Every moment stretched to twice its length, drawing him further from the surface of things. The final seconds before sleep were a confusion. He thought he heard a voice, or the echo of his own heart, or perhaps the forest itself, whispering in a language made only of wind and damp. He tried to respond, tried to call out, but his lips would not move, and the sound he made was swallowed at once by the hush. The cold seemed to seep through him, as if he were no more than a shadow painted on the earth. The last thing he saw was the moons, peering down with the impassive curiosity of insects, their light neither warm nor cold, only indifferent. He slipped under, not gently but as if pulled by a current too strong to resist. In that instant, Arthur ceased to be awake at all. He was a stone sinking in a black and bottomless well, a thought expelled from the mind that conceived it. Sleep took him, and the darkness that followed was absolute. Arthur did not know what woke him. One moment he was a stone at the bottom of a well, heavy and senseless. The next he was flailing upward, gasping on the surface, every nerve singing. He surfaced from sleep with a violence that left his heart rattling in his chest. For a moment he was blind, his sight dazzled by a brightness unfamiliar and fierce, and his hands scrabbled at the ground as if to keep the rest of him from slipping under again. The dreamless void behind his eyes receded, leaving only a memory of cold and the echo of something vast and indifferent. The light was the first thing he registered, but it was not the dawn gold he remembered from home. This was a thinner, harder illumination, the color of frost on stone, and it seemed to leach the warmth from everything it touched. Above, the sky, if it was a sky, shimmered behind the canopy, traversed by a raw, silvery band that flickered and pulsed. It looked less like sunlight than the reflection of some distant, unapproachable fire. Arthur blinked, at once comforted and unsettled by the realization that day still followed night in this place, even if both had been stripped of their familiar character. He tried to gauge the hour, recalling how his father had taught him to read the time from the angle of morning light on the thatch, the length of shadow under the eaves. Here, the trunks of the trees, tall, black, and without knots or branches for the first several man-heights, cast no clear shadow. The light fell as if from everywhere at once, and the undergrowth glowed faintly where patches of it caught the open sky. Mid-morning, perhaps, if the forest was to be believed. But Arthur already mistrusted its signals. He had learned in the night that this world, whatever it was, had no interest in being understood. Pain arrived next, in a series of staggered reports. His neck and back ached from the angle at which he'd slept, slumped like a broken puppet against the root. His left side throbbed with a deep, ugly bruise from where he'd struck the wall of the well, he supposed, during the fall that had rearranged his life. The skin around his right ankle was scraped raw, and his fingers, when he flexed them, felt both bruised and oddly numb, as if only recently reattached. He lay still for as long as he could bear it, waiting for his body to accustom itself to the inventory of hurts, then tried a cautious roll to his side. The world tilted, and he nearly retched. He fought it down, breathing through his teeth until the queasiness subsided to a manageable simmer. He forced himself upright, slow and careful, bracing his hands against the earth. The ground here was springy, layered with centuries of shed needles and leaves, and it gave slightly under his weight. For a while he just sat, head bowed and arms limp at his sides, letting the pulse of his blood reestablish itself. His stomach growled, a dry, angry sound, more complaint than pain, and his mouth tasted of moss and old sleep. The thirst was worse than the hunger. His tongue felt like it was wrapped in spiderweb. He surveyed his condition. The old cloak still clung to his shoulders, though the fastening at the neck had torn. His shirt was ripped along the seam, and the woolen trousers were stained a new color, almost blue-black, from the soil. One boot had come loose and hung at an odd angle, but both feet were covered, and the makeshift bindings he'd tied around his shins during last night's shivering were intact. He remembered, with a small shock, that he had been afraid he would not survive to see this morning. Now the fear had thinned to a kind of stubborn, exhausted endurance. Arthur stood, swaying, and brushed the leaf litter off his legs. His hands trembled, but he made fists until they steadied. He took stock of his surroundings, as if he were still at home, still in the habit of checking for traps or wolves or the return of his father. But here the danger was deeper and less obvious. He was at the base of a rise, the knoll where he had collapsed the night before. The clearing was ringed by a palisade of trees so regular in their spacing that for a moment he thought it must be the work of men. On closer inspection, it was worse. The trees were uniform in height and girth, their bark so smooth it reflected the strange light in a greasy sheen. Nothing like this grew in the woods around his village. Even the leaves, which should have been the ragged flags of autumn by now, were untouched. A dense green-black with a waxy, almost armored surface. The only sign of decay was the carpet of old needles and the occasional drift of withered petals. He took a tentative step forward. The forest did not react. No birds startled from the branches, no animal sounds retreated ahead of him. There was silence, or something more profound than silence. The living hush of a world that did not recognize him as one of its own. He listened for the river song that always marked home, the distant calls of crows, the wind nattering in the birches. Nothing. Only the faint, ever-present whine of insects, their bodies invisible, but their wings vibrating at the edge of hearing. He turned in a slow circle, orienting himself. The light was brightest to the east, where the trees thinned and the ground sloped downward. That way, perhaps, toward water or the promise of escape. But his gaze was caught by movement at his feet, a flicker like a muscle tick. He crouched, ignoring the protest from his ribs, and saw that the roots here were thick with small white flowers, their stalks so fine they bent at the slightest breeze. When he reached to touch one, it flinched away from his finger, the petals snapping closed in an instant. He jerked his hand back, startled. A trick of the nerves, he told himself, but the memory of old stories, of spiteful spirits, of hungry plants, crept in before he could push it away. He rose again, brushing his dirt-streaked hands on his cloak. His own scent was alarming. The sweat, the sharp tang of fear, the slow rot of blood drying on skin. He tried to remember what he'd been told about surviving in wild places. You must not let them know you're afraid. A man must own his fear, not broadcast it. He checked the sky again, hoping for some sign of the sun, but the only constant was the colorless fire that burned behind the clouds. Time seemed to have no grip here. The shadows moved but did not lengthen, and the air grew neither warmer nor cooler as he waited. There was no sense in loitering. He would have to walk, or else become part of the mulch and memory of this place. He began to move, careful at first, testing the ground for traps he could not name. Every few steps he paused, listening, really listening. And with each break, he noticed more of the world's strangeness. The metallic hum of the insects grew louder the deeper he went, resolving into an almost musical oscillation. The air, which had seemed sharp and sterile before, now carried an undercurrent of sweetness and another odor, sour and overripe, like fruit left too long in the sun. He wondered if it was a warning or an invitation. As he moved away from the knoll, the forest revealed new patterns. The trees began to curve overhead, their trunks twining together in pairs, then separating again, forming natural arches. Moss grew up the sides in sinuous bands, bright green against the black bark. In places, the ground opened to reveal hollows lined with glossy stones, each one a perfect oval, set like eggs in a nest. He skirted these, remembering the stories of places that ate men whole. He tried to think like a hunter, like his father had taught him. A man's first mistake is thinking the world wants to be found, his father used to say, spitting into the fire. Best to move like you're already lost. Arthur picked his way forward, keeping to the indirect path, not trusting the lure of the open spaces. His appetite returned in a rush, and he looked for mushrooms, for berries, for anything that might stave off the hunger. The undergrowth here was stingy, no brambles or familiar weeds, only the flowers, which recoiled at his approach. Once, he saw what looked like a cluster of pale blue berries sprouting from a fallen limb. But when he tried to pick one, the entire cluster pulled away and vanished beneath the leaf litter. He laughed in spite of himself, the sound dry and unconvincing. He wondered if this was what it felt like to be a ghost. Not dead exactly, but unable to touch or be touched by the world. After a time, he found himself at the lip of a shallow gorge. Below, a thin stream trickled over stones, its surface broken by the occasional leap of a silvery shape, fish or something like it. The banks were soft with mud, and the smell of water was enough to make his throat close with longing. He scrambled down, nearly losing his footing, and crouched at the edge to drink. The water tasted of iron and something sweeter, maybe sap, but it was cold and clean enough. He drank until the ache in his throat lessened, each gulp an animal act, loud, greedy, and without thought. The cold of the water burrowed into his jaw, a sharp ache that made his teeth ring, and for a moment, the sensation of thirst was replaced by a sensation of simply existing. All the higher functions drowned out by the demand to keep living. When he had finished, Arthur stayed crouched on the bank and stared at his reflection. It was an unfamiliar face, gaunt and mottled with dirt, eyes rimmed red as berries after a frost. He felt the need to touch it, to confirm the physical reality of his own body, but his hands were already numb with cold and slick with mud, so he left them resting limply in the stream. He splashed water on his face in a gesture of ritual more than hygiene. He remembered his mother doing this the morning after his father had died, as if some part of her could be washed clean of grief. But the water only made the bruises and scrapes stand out more. He blinked, letting the droplets run into his mouth and down his neck, until the last of the night seemed to drain out of him. When he opened his eyes again, he caught a glint on the bank, just below the surface where the mud met water. For a moment he thought it was a trick of the light, a sun spangle or a fish scale. But as he looked closer, he saw that the shape was fixed, stubbornly material. He crawled forward, feeling the mud suck at his knees, and gingerly probed the spot with his fingers. Something metallic, smooth and cold as the heart of winter. He hesitated, half expecting it to vanish or slip deeper into the silt, but the object remained, stubbornly itself. Arthur dug around the edges, careful not to slice his hand, and soon worked the thing free. It was a dagger, but unlike any he had seen before. The blade was short, no longer than his forearm from elbow to wrist, but wickedly pointed, its edge uneven with a mosaic of rust. Where the river had eaten away at the metal, it left pits and whorls like the surface of bone found in the forest after a thaw. The hilt was wrapped in some kind of leather, dark and petrified by the years, and the pommel bore marks, runes perhaps, or just the idle carvings of whoever had lost it centuries ago. Arthur turned the dagger over, testing its balance in his palm, and felt a thrill of both horror and delight. It was real, more real than any tool or toy he'd owned, as if the years spent in the river had concentrated its nature to a single, undeniable purpose. He pressed a thumb against the flat of the blade and found it still sharp enough to draw blood without effort. The sight of the red bead blooming on his skin startled him, and he instinctively wiped it on his shirt, leaving a streak to join the old stains. A new fear took hold. If he found the dagger, what else lay buried in this world, waiting to be unearthed? He scanned the creek bed, searching for other relics, but saw nothing except the endless churn of water and silt. He looked up, half expecting to see a figure among the trees, watching him with silent accusation. But the forest remained blank and impassive, the only movement a slow ripple of leaves in the high canopy. He tried to imagine the circumstances that had left the dagger here. Had it been dropped in flight, or placed as an offering? Was there a body nearby, bones eroded to nothing by centuries of slow dissolution? He poked at the mud with a stick, morbidly curious, but found only pebbles and the empty hulls of beetles. The imagined stories of violence and failure seemed to cling to the object, as if it had never truly belonged to anyone for long. He gripped the hilt more tightly, feeling the shiver run through his hand and up his forearm. The markings on the blade were not familiar. No sigils from home, none of the old prayers, but they carried a logic, a sequence, as though someone had tried to encode a message in the metal itself. He traced the lines with a fingernail, trying to guess their meaning. The first looked like a crooked Y, the next like a crescent with a bar through it, the last a spiraling dot. He repeated the pattern in his mind, over and over, until it began to feel like something he'd always known. He kept the dagger in his right hand as he rose to his feet, not trusting the world to let him go unarmed. The air felt colder now, or perhaps it only seemed so because he was newly aware of the dangers it might carry. He wiped the blade clean on his trousers, smearing a fresh ribbon of rust into the fabric, and slipped the tool into his belt. It was an awkward fit, too heavy, too eager, but he accepted the discomfort. Maybe it would remind him to be careful, to move like a man who had something worth losing. He stepped away from the bank, back into the ambiguous safety of the woods. The forest seemed changed by his discovery, as if it were now aware of him and the choices he had made. The insect whine had grown shriller, and there was a sense of being watched, not by a single pair of eyes, but by the world itself. A diffuse attention, patient and unblinking. Arthur walked, keeping the creek to his right, and tried to think of what this new tool meant. It could be a gift, or a warning, or simply the leftover debris of an older, crueler time. He found himself weighing each branch and hollow as a potential threat, his senses sharpened to the point of pain. The game of survival had changed, from hiding to hunting, from endurance to assertion. He wondered if this was how his father had felt in the dark years after the wars, always on edge, always waiting for what came next. The terrain grew rockier as he moved downstream, the trees giving way to patches of open ground where moss grew in thick mats. He stopped once to examine a patch of mushrooms, white as snow and clustered in a ring. He remembered the old tales. Some mushrooms fed you, some put you to sleep forever, and left them untouched. Instead, he gnawed on a strip of dried meat from his pocket, savoring the salt and the memory of home. The act of eating seemed almost sacramental, a pledge to continue the day. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was impossible to measure time in the even, directionless light. Once he heard a noise behind him, the crack of a twig, and spun around with the dagger raised. Nothing. Only the impression of movement, a ripple left behind by something clever enough not to be caught. He pressed on, following the thread of the creek. Eventually, the banks flattened and the water spread into a small, stagnant pool. Here, the mud was black and glossy, flecked with flecks of silver mica. At the edge of the pool, he saw a cluster of footprints, not his own, but something larger, three-toed and splayed like the print of a heron. They were fresh, the mud still glistening in the depressions, and he crouched to examine them. The prints led away from the water, up a slight incline, and vanished into a thicket of ferns. Arthur hesitated. He weighed the risk of following versus the risk of staying still. The rules were different in this place. He could sense it. Still, the idea of another living thing, even a dangerous one, was preferable to wandering alone in the endless silence. He tightened his grip on the dagger and crept forward, mindful of every twig underfoot. The ferns closed around him, their fronds heavy with dew. Each step was measured, and he forced himself to breathe shallowly, to be less present in the air. The prince continued, weaving among the trunks in a pattern that felt deliberate, almost mocking. He was being led. He knew it, felt it in his nerves, but curiosity was stronger than fear now. He emerged into a second clearing, smaller than the last, but ringed by the same impossibly regular trees. In the center stood a cairn of stones, shaped into a rough pyramid, no taller than a man's waist. Atop the pile was another artifact, a mask carved from wood and painted with crude lines of ochre and blue. It faced him directly, its features exaggerated, wide eyes, a gaping, toothless mouth. The sight rooted him to the spot. He advanced slowly, compelled by the same need that had made him dig for the dagger. The mask was ancient, the paint worn but still vibrant, and he could see where someone had carved the lines deep enough to survive centuries. He reached out, expecting it to crumble at his touch, but it was solid, heavy with the memory of whoever had worn it. He lifted it carefully, turning it over in his hands. The inside was stained dark, as if from sweat or something older. He wondered if it would fit his own face. A branch snapped behind him. He spun, dagger in hand, and saw nothing. Nothing but the suggestion of movement at the edge of the clearing. The mask felt hot in his grip, as if it resisted being taken. He weighed it, then made a decision. He placed it in the crook of his arm and backed away from the cairn, not daring to turn his back until he reached the line of trees. Arthur's breath came in shallow, frantic bursts. The mask in the crook of his arm had lost its wooden coolness. It was feverish now, as if it had a pulse of its own, beating fast and angry. He felt a stinging warmth leach through the sleeve of his shirt, radiating up his arm into the tender skin of his armpit. He wanted to let it fall, to cast it away before it could do more harm. But the same compulsion that made him dig for the dagger held him rooted to the spot, clutching the mask tighter with every heartbeat. He stared at the mask, half expecting it to open its gaping mouth and scream. Instead, it seemed to throb, the painted lines swelling and shrinking in time with his breath. In the high spaces of the clearing, a wind rose. Not a breeze, but a living thing, thick with the scent of rot and ozone, the kind of air that signaled the approach of storms. The mask's eyes, big, round, childlike, caught the blue of the sky and threw it back in jagged flashes. He tried to move, to draw the dagger and threaten the mask into submission, but the world had narrowed to a single point. The burning memory of his father's voice in his head, warning him again and again to never touch what could not be named. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to wake up from the feverish present. But the mask's heat only grew more intense, until it was an agony nested deep in the bones of his wrist. Then, all at once, the mask ignited, a flare of pure blue, so bright he saw it through his eyelids, as if someone had set off a magnesium torch in the hollow of his skull. The clearing didn't just fill with light, it became light. Every tree and stone and blade of grass scrawled over with jittering veins of electric blue. The air took on a thickness, a pressure, that made his teeth ache and his bowels twist. The forest had been silent before, but now it hummed with 1,000 insect wings, a rising chorus that reverberated in his molars. Arthur staggered back, nearly losing his grip on both mask and dagger. The runework on the mask's painted surface came alive, scribbling their sigils in the air with looping, impossible speed. The lines detached themselves from the wood, peeling away like strips of old bark. Only instead of falling, they hung suspended, hanging like the afterimage of a sparkler or the residue of a dream. He watched, disbelieving, as the first of these burning glyphs floated free of the mask and drifted toward him, slow and purposeful, like a wasp drawn to sweet fruit. The smoke did not rise. It drifted downward, coiling toward his chest, tracing the path of his shirt buttons before veering, hungry, precise, toward the dagger in his hand. The motion was impossible, as if the blue fire remembered a shape it had once known and was determined to repossess it. Arthur tried to recoil, but the knife was bound to him. It had become an extension of his will, and could not be dropped. One by one, the runes from the mask found their match on the blade. As blue flame met the pitted steel, the corrosion hissed and spat, boiling away centuries of rust in a single shuddering instant. The blade sang with the impact, a brittle, high-pitched keening that set the birds in the trees to panicked flight. Each rune, as it was absorbed, left its mark. The crooked Y, the barred crescent, the spiraling dot, each flared, then blackened, then became a scar on the metal itself. The hilt of the dagger seared his palm, but he did not let go. He watched, mesmerized, as the handle's old leather binding charred away, revealing the naked tang beneath. The metal drank in the blue light, growing hotter with every second. A smell like burnt hair filled Arthur's nose, and he realized it was his own skin smoldering against the grip. Panic rose in him, but the rest of the world had gone silent, all sound compressed into the throb of his own racing blood. By the time the last ribbon of smoke was torn from the mask, Arthur was on his knees and weeping, not from fear or pain, but from the certainty that something irreparable was happening to him, atom by atom. The heat from the mask was gone, replaced by a cold so intense it numbed his shoulder and jaw. He looked down. The mask had splintered, hairline fractures racing through the wood, its painted symbols now destroyed or gone. He tried to cradle it, to apologize, but the mask was crumbling to dust in his hands, the dust slick and dark as river silt. A final gust of wind lifted the powdered mask away, scattering it over the cairn and into the waiting trees. Arthur watched the fragments swirl and disappear, then slumped forward, clutching the dagger to his heaving chest. The weapon was transformed. The blade now shone with a living, opalescent sheen, its edge impossibly fine, every rune etched into the steel as if by the hand of a god. The pommel smoked gently, then cooled, leaving a blue-black fingerprint charred into the underside. He was emptied, wrung out, as if all the water and marrow had been drained from his body and replaced with something sharper, stranger. He blinked, and the world seemed newly limned. Colors too saturated, sounds too crisp, even the air itself abrasive in its clarity. He stood, legs trembling, and stared at the cairn, now bare except for the scatter of mask fragments at its base. For a long time, Arthur did not move. He waited for the old self, the one who foraged and wandered and feared the dark, to return, but that version of him was gone, burnt away with the mask. In its place was a new vigilance, a sense that the world was no longer indifferent, but actively watching, waiting for what he might do next. The blue runes on the dagger pulsed with a faint afterlight, and he felt their rhythm sync with his own heartbeat. He slipped the knife back into his belt, careful to avoid the still warm blade. His hands shook, but it wasn't entirely from exhaustion. There was an excitement, a curiosity that edged out the worst of his terror. Whatever had happened here, it was not an ending, but a beginning, a test or a summons, or maybe just a reminder that nothing stayed buried forever. He moved to the cairn, kneeling beside the wind-scattered debris of the mask. Gently, almost reverently, he swept the remaining dust into his palm and let it fall between the stones. It felt like closing a wound, or maybe sealing a promise he didn't yet understand. He whispered something, a word, or just a sound, and the wind, now gentle, carried it away. He straightened, wiped his hands, and lifted his face to the sky. The clearing was quiet again, the trees resuming their patient vigilance. Whatever presence had awoken was now part of him, carried in the flesh and in the blade. Arthur took a step into the ferns, then another, each stride surer than the last. He did not look back until the cairn had vanished from sight. Only then did he notice a faint blue glow tracing the path ahead, as if the ground itself remembered his footsteps and chose to mark them for the next traveler.